Violence has erupted as a community mourns the deaths of 3 young girls stabbed at a Taylor Swift dance class.
If you're watching us in the UK, you'll be aware of this story already. If you're not watching us in the UK, I guess you'll perhaps be aware because of the ongoing stories in countries like the United States and France that centre around unease and disruption when it comes to the subject of migration. This story has already caused a lot of controversy, with many people saying that the identity of the murderer ought to be made public, and various conflicting claims made about the identity of the young man who's evidently a minor. This country, like many countries, already is starting to feel like a tinderbox. Feels like things could go off at any moment. There's been rioting in Leeds. There's been rioting overnight in Southport. There's been rioting recently in Dublin. Many of these riots centre around real or perceived grievances around the subject of migration, which in itself, however you carve it up, is a consequence of globalism. Let's have a look at this tragic story with as much clear-sightedness as we can muster, with the bewilderment and beleaguered state induced by such tragic events, and see if we can understand some of the complexity of a story like this and whether or not anything conciliatory can be plucked from the ashes of such a dreadful, dreadful tale.
Violence has erupted as a community mourns the deaths of 3 young girls stabbed at a Taylor Swift dance class. A riot breaking out in the English town where the attack unfolded.
A broken community comes together to mourn at a vigil before anger and division boils over. Riot police called in to try and control crowds who gathered at a Southport mosque. Officers pelted with bricks and bins, vehicles set on fire, following the stabbing attacks that claimed 3 lives. Hart Street and the wider Southport community are hurting. Many locals telling me they feel helpless, struggling to come to terms with such an evil act. A 17-year-old remains in custody. False claims about his identity spreading online. Police say he was born in Wales. As some locals rage, the families of the girls mourn. In Southport, England.
Now, there are sort of a series of reactions to the event, and it's really curious because these are the kind of commentators that in my country get significantly censored. I'm going to start with this post from David Icke. Now, David Icke he's one of the most heavily censored individuals in the world. Falling for the plot, says Icke. Scenes in Southport near a mosque in the wake of the child murders. They are pawns in a game they don't understand, and this is what they need to know. I've been warning for so long that the plan was to allow unchecked numbers of people from other cultures and religions into the West, mostly adult young men, and then instigate trigger events to create uncivil war between them and the indigenous culture. Now, I know a lot of you will be sympathetic to that idea. I've heard Alex Jones talk about ideas like that. Tucker Carlson has been attacked, hasn't he, for talking about replacement theory. Remember when he was in Australia and that journalist said, oh, the replacement of white individuals, and Tucker said, no, it's not just white individuals, it's blue-collar or working-class people. Now, when I had a conversation with George Galloway, who's very much a figure of the left and very pro-Muslim, I think you'd agree, he said that when migration impacts the ability of working people to earn a good wage, then it's a problem that wherever you sit on the political spectrum, you should be interested. And that's before we get into the kind of ideas that are obviously powerful motivators in resurgent nationalist movements like the EDL in this country. Where we'll take this in a minute, which I think you'll be fascinated to learn about, is how we get from David Icke into Tony Blair. For if there is a face of globalism, it may yet be Tony Blair's face. He uses this idea of migration, not in association with these tragic events, but in a general way, to legitimise the idea of digital IDs more generally. We are in a classic divide and rule in which the two sides, this is still Icke's post, manipulated by the same force, are brought into conflict to create chaos and mayhem. 1, to justify fascist laws. 2, generate widespread fear and anger. And 3, have the sides so focused on fighting each other that they don't see the strings attached to both held by the same hand. Both sides are being played by a hidden hand via puppet governments with mass immigration that has transformed Western cities with the incoming cultures. Now, certainly now we're moving back into territory that classic pundits of the right have been commenting on for a long while, whether you're talking about PJW or Alex Jones or Tucker, whether you're talking about independent media or even more contemporary media, or even now if you're talking about a purportedly centre-left political leader, although that's sort of difficult to claim, like Keir Starmer, saying that migration is out of control. So, of course, a figure like Nigel Farage would say he's not going to do anything about it. Or when we saw Joe Biden, when he was still president, remember that a million years ago, emulating Trump's border policies. Although, of course, what people on the right would say is, yeah, they're using that rhetoric, but they'll never deploy that policy. When it comes to rhetoric, at least, everyone acknowledges that migration is a problem, it seems. That there is less inclination, isn't there, would you agree, to sort of say, oh, no, come on, we have to have open borders and we have to protect one another. Even though the values of compassion and kindness are hugely significant, defining even, it's starting to seem like the problems that migration generates are very serious and have to be addressed. We're starting to see sort of incredible consequences. Not that I am at this point suggesting that this particular story is related to that, because we still don't have conclusive evidence. But more generally, you can see how the kind of unrest that Ike is describing here is becoming either much more prevalent or is being discussed a lot more. We can't continue to bring you this beautiful content without the support of our partners.
Hey, this is exciting. We've got a great partner today. It's Rumble. But beyond Rumble, it's Rumble's latest venture. Let me ask you first, are you a Sleepy Joe type character with zero cognitive performance, struggling to muster focus and brain power for basic things like running the United States of America? You've got to stop drinking woke liberal coffee that hates you and your way of life and start your day by drinking Rumble's very own 1775 coffee. This is going to be the best tasting coffee you've ever had. Seriously good, ethically sourced from a family farm in the high altitude mountains of Bolivia. Not in the Bolivian lowlands, run not by a family but by a single man still living with a pet. No, instead of waking up and drinking your big corporation-owned woke ideology coffee that's probably making you sick from the pesticides it's sprayed with, try Rumble's 1775 revolutionary coffee. Support freedom of speech. Build a parallel economy that actually values you and loves you. My favourite? It's dark, of course. I've always found the lure of the dark irresistible. I'm sorry, how can I stay mad at you? But you're just going to have to wait over there for a little while. Level up your morning routine with a 1775 coffee. Sleep all night knowing your hard-earned dollary dues are going towards supporting freedom-loving creators like me on Rumble. Visit 1775coffee.com now. Pick up your first bag. Use the code BRAND to save 10% on your first order. Oh, come on. Why choose, you know? Okay, back to the content.
This has been coldly calculated for decades, especially since the Blair era, which set out to culturally change Britain in a way that was irreversible. The focus should be directed at those in political power and their masters in the shadows who have made this happen and go on doing so. Cultures from other lands need to respect the culture they enter and not, as some do, seek to usurp it and impose their own. If you go on doing that, then uncivil war is inevitable. Both sides have been put in this situation by a cult that hates them. Whether white or brown, you're all just human trash to the cult. We have to find common ground and realise that we are being played off against each other for an agenda that involves the fascist control of all of us. Both sides need to realise there is a common foe and find common cause in responding to that. If we don't, we ain't seen nothing yet. I suppose what Ike is suggesting is that civil unrest will be used to justify further social controls and civilian management, as well as he says in that post, distracting us from the possibility that there are central authorities that benefit from these disputes. It's difficult, isn't it, to go into that kind of territory when at the very core of this issue are free, murdered children. But there's another post here that from a pundit and commentator in our country, Majid Nawaz, in response to this post. What did last night achieve? Delaney Dowding responding to the rioting. He says, the same nefarious parties who condemned rioting in Hare Hills by lawless immigrants in our country are provoking lawless rioting in Southport because of immigrants. This is Tony Blair's wet dream. Civil war, divide and conquer, digital ID and technocracy. Is this where this is heading. While we learn more about whoever committed those murders, it's important, I think, to bear in mind the potential for control afforded to those in authority when countries fall into dispute and unrest. Let's have a look at Tony Blair, who plainly is a good embodiment of that.
Digital ID for me is a very big part of the future, and let me explain why. So your digital ID can play a part in COVID, but also if you think of the transactions that you want to do now with your customers, it's much simpler for them if they have a digital identity. Or you take the big issue in the Western world today, which is, quite apart from COVID, I would say is worries about immigration, who has the right to be in your country, who has the right not to be. Without a form of identity, it's very hard to tell who's got a right to be in a country, who's not. So inevitably, governments are going to move in this direction. Absolutely inevitably.
So that's sort of how you could see globalists, if that's how you would describe Tony Blair, responding to this kind of unrest. Whether it's COVID, commerce, or civil unrest, digital ID and civilian management is a good idea. Here's Tony Blair on the subject of immigration.
There are genuine concerns about immigration. Concerns about, particularly, frankly, and again, you've got to be honest about this in the left, you want to deal with the problem. There's an anxiety about people coming in from Muslim countries as to whether they are truly going to integrate with society, or whether you might have security or problems to do with extremism coming in on the back of it. If you literally just say, well, it's too difficult, I don't want to have that conversation, fine, but then you're not having the conversation that your people are having.
How do you imagine these events afford opportunity to people whose focus is nation-first politics? Let's have a look at Nigel Farage's response to this. Nigel Farage and I spoke briefly at the Republican National Congress, and when it comes to the issue of massive centralised bureaucracies and mass migration, Nigel Farage is obviously a significant voice, whether you agree with him or not. Let's have a look at Nigel Farage's response to this.
Well, it's pretty horrendous. The third young girl has died as a result of the stabbings yesterday in Southport. I obviously join everybody in my horror at what has happened. I know the Prime Minister went to lay flowers and was heckled, and it shows you how unhappy the public are with the state of law and order in our country. I have to say there are one or two questions. Was this guy being monitored by the security services? Some reports say he was, others less sure. The police say it's a non-terror incident, just as they said the stabbing of an Army Lieutenant Colonel in uniform on the streets of Kent the other day was a non-terror incident. I just wonder whether the truth is being withheld from us. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is a fair and legitimate question. What I do know is something is going horribly wrong in our once beautiful country.
Something's changed about the agenda of the establishment. When I was younger, 10, 20 years ago, there was always an appetite to frame violence as terror. It was, I suppose, I don't know what's altered. This incident is likely related to terror. This migrant community of terrorists. There was a real appetite in mainstream media to frame stories in that way. It seems subsequent to the Iraq wars and perhaps the agenda having been met when it comes to excursions and incursions into the Middle East, it seems to be the opposite way, an attempt to frame things as being discrete from terror or extremism. It's interesting. Why would that have changed? Is it our job? What do you think? Is it our job to continue to return to the extraordinary grief of the people directly affected and consider what would likely mean events like this would take place less frequently? I suppose that's what we're all doing in our own way, isn't it? And trying to manage the sense that there are various political and cultural forces that want to exploit the event. And those include mainstream and peripheral forces. Here, for example, is the leader of our country in the accepted and ordinary fashion doing that. It's an interesting piece of pageantry, isn't it? And it sort of shows you that there is a type of dreadful theatre associated with these events, and what people will be thirsting is a response that somehow makes sense to an event that probably can't ever make sense. So while as a parent and as a human being at the moment it's difficult to tackle or grapple with the murder of 3 young girls and what the cultural implications of it and what the unravelling and analysis of it might lead us to, what we can be alert to, as well as I'm sure a roster of other issues, is the potential of the state and existing authority to exploit this event eventually to legitimise further power and civilian control. In just the way you might say that even if you take a very generous analysis of the coronavirus pandemic, health crises can be exploited to legitimise control. People become more malleable and willing to accept overt measures of control when they're frightened, divided or full of hate. And I suppose that's when we have to assess our own ability to remain, particularly if we're not directly affected, like the poor grieving parent and others affected by the death of these 3 children, to a degree stay connected to some kind of perspicacity and some kind of faith, even though at a time like this it's obviously extremely difficult. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments and the chat. We are able to continue to make this content as a result of the support we receive, of course, from you, but also... Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.